This week on the Stephen Harriott Show.
Priests don't want to upset parishioners, and you're seen as judgmental, and there's many kind of younger Catholics who don't agree with the Church's teaching.
UK Catholic commentator Caroline Farrow gives us an idea of what to think of the new papal exhortation.
Removed because it was considered violent, while it was a picture of our crucified Lord and Savior Jesus Christ, you know?
They're not wrong.
I mean, it is violent.
As Facebook's anti-Catholic bias is showing, Catholic Vote political director Josh Mercer joins to explain.
What I have to share to young people is something they've never heard.
And I speak with Catholic speaker and author Daniel Mattson about his important work of bringing good news to young people who struggle with their sexuality. Hello, this is Stephen Harriott from the Stephen Harriott Show by Catholic Vote, and the Pope has just issued a new apostolic exhortation, and boy, are some of my least favorite people really running with it. Now, just to be clear up front, I'm not criticizing the papal exhortation. I haven't read it, okay? All I know is what is being done with a certain quote from it, which is it's being used to beat some of my favorite people over the heads, and that's not fair. So I just want to come to their defense and counter what's being done with the exhortation. Again, just to be clear, not attacking the exhortation, which I have not yet read, but I am attacking what's being done with it. So there's a particular quote from the exhortation where it condemns the quote-unquote ideological error of valuing one ethical issue to the exclusion of others. And the example given was abortion. We shouldn't over-focus on abortion to the neglect of others, and particularly, quote, equally sacred are the lives of the poor, it says in the exhortation. Well, that's being, again, used to hit people over the head in the pro-life movement. Okay, but here's the thing. Of course, the human dignity of the poor is the same as the human dignity of the unborn. The lives of the poor are just as valuable as the lives of the unborn. And as I recently said on Twitter, as soon as the Supreme Court legalizes the quote-unquote right to kill poor people, I'll advocate for the poor just as strongly as I now advocate for the unborn. See, it's a question of which one is more urgently under attack and in need of defense. And of course, pro-lifers are advocating for the unborn because of their human dignity. And they would do the same for the poor if they were just as much under threat. But they're not as much under threat. And imagine if they were, all right? This is the context. Let me just paint you a little picture. Imagine if we did live in a world where the poor faced anywhere near the level of dehumanizing hostility as the unborn currently face in this real-world situation that we're in right now, which is what motivates the pro-life movement. Imagine if the Supreme Court did legalize a right to kill poor people when they inconvenience us or when they devalue our property by moving into our gentrified neighborhood. Imagine people marching in the streets demanding protections not for the poor, but for the right to kill the poor. Imagine people marching proudly with picket signs that said, "Murder the poor without apology," or "My upper-middle-class neighborhood, my choice." Imagine mainstream headlines complaining about state laws that make it harder to kill a poor person. Imagine the ACLU writing letters to legislators saying that they oppose, quote, creating theories of human rights for the poor. Imagine the squishy Catholics at the National Catholic Reporter putting out podcasts about being anti-poor and Christian in the context of a world where it was okay to kill the poor. Yeah, imagine mainstream Catholic commentators arguing that many people of faith find themselves in the middle of the supposedly black and white issue of murdering poor people. It's disgusting. And of course we would stand against that because it would be our Christian duty to stand against that culture of death. Luckily, that culture of death doesn't exist for the poor. Very unfortunately, very urgently, very infuriatingly, that culture does exist for the unborn. And it's the number one priority for many people in the pro-life movement, and they do not deserve to be harangued for it. I know people who are pro-life, but are otherwise more or less opposed to me on every political issue. We get along. You know why? Because they're not monsters about the pro-life issue. And they don't harangue pro-lifers and say, you're not really pro-life because you disagree with me about the minimum wage, right? Because they're decent people, and they see that despite our differences, at least we can all agree on human dignity and the duty of Christians to defend that human dignity, especially where it's most under threat. So stop haranguing the pro-life movement, all right? Find common ground, sure, right? Try to convince pro-lifers to agree with you about minimum wage or about foreign policy or any other issue. Try to get them to agree with you. But don't play emotional blackmail by saying that they value the human dignity of the unborn to the exclusion of the human dignity of other people who are much less urgently under threat. Just quit it with that manipulative garbage. Again, I'm Stephen Harriott, and this is The Stephen Harriott Show, the show that's so good that almost every bad person hates it. And now I'm joined by UK Catholic journalist Caroline Farrow, a great commentator. She has a wonderful ability to be hot-headed or cool-headed as the situation dictates, and I really admire that. Thank you, first of all, very much for joining us, Caroline.
Thanks for having me.
We're talking a little bit this week about the papal exhortation, which is called Everything is Awesome, Everything is Cool When You're Part of the Team, only in Latin. First of all, what is the exhortation in terms of its weight as a teaching document?
Okay, so as a teaching document, it carries maybe slightly more weight than your local priest's homily. So, we should always pay attention to what the Pope has to say and say, what are you trying to teach us? It is part of the magisterium, but it isn't actual doctrine. So we can read it, we can take note, we can say, okay, Pope Francis, Your Holiness, this is what you're saying to us, but we don't necessarily have to abide by the letter of it. And it's not teaching us, it's not infallible. It's not an ex cathedra statement. It's just, the Pope tried to teach us something.
You could almost say that it's like a homily in newsletter form from the Pope.
Yeah, almost.
Is that right?
Yeah, that's right. I mean, it's one step down from a papal encyclical and one step up from, like a homily. So by sort of criticising it or analysing it, you're not doing anything heretical. You're not challenging the Pope's teaching authority. You're saying, okay, this is my impression of the document. This is what I think of it. And so do that in good charity, then that's fine.
Right. Well, and also some people of a certain political bent have loved the document, particularly 2 lines in it, and they've made heavy use of it, as I've already mentioned. And you wrote eloquently on that topic. And I think that's almost more urgently to be addressed than the exhortation itself, which, of course, we can all, as you recommend, quietly read, personally reflect on our own lives and how it applies to us in our own call to holiness. But what about the reaction and the general use of the document so far?
Well, I think what's concerning about it is, predictably, the liberal press or the left-leaning press, so the Wall Street Journal, the New York Times, various kind of left-leaning publications have taken one line in it which says that basically all lives are equal, that the life of the migrant has equal validity to the life of the unborn. Now, and everyone has taken that and interpreted that as campaigning for migrants and campaigning for refugees is as important as campaigning for the unborn. And there's this kind of implication that actually Catholics need to stop campaigning for the unborn.
Right.
There's one thing that the Pope says, and it does really concern me. He puts scare quotes around the use of grave bioethical issues, scare quotes around the word grave. Now that bothers me because that kind of minimises the seriousness of bioethical issues, which, have implications, the deepest implications for humanity. The idea that we can create life in a laboratory, we can search for this non-existent perfection. What implications or consequences is this going to have down the line in generations' time for humanity? In the UK, we've got things like 3-parent embryos, we're pushing for embryo experimentation. Right. There's all kinds of things going on. And this could really profoundly affect the future of humanity. So to kind of put grave in scare quotes, I think is a bit unhelpful. And I think while Pope Francis is right, nobody is saying that the lives of the unborn are worth more than the lives of anybody else. He talks about not prioritising the issue. And I think this is one of the challenges of Pope Francis's papacy here, because he's South American Pope, as we know, he's first Pope from South America, and he's speaking to this universal church. And he's speaking, I think, from the perspective of a South American, where most countries in South America have quite heavy regulation and legislation regarding abortion. So in Chile, for example, it is practically outlawed. But here in the UK, we have the most liberal abortion laws in Europe. So at the moment, you can abort.
And real quick, also in the U.S., we're even more liberal than you in many of our states. We are extremely lenient.
Yeah. So This is really problematic. And in the UK, we are facing a number of pro-life challenges. So we're coming up to, in a couple of weeks' time, it's the 50th anniversary of the passing of the Abortion Act, or when it was implemented. And in that time, 8 million unborn have died. And what we're facing now is, so on Tuesday, in a London borough of Ealing, I was there, they've passed a draconian law forbidding pro-life vigils outside the abortion clinic. Now, these are vigils really help mothers in need. They've now been banned. They're looking to completely decriminalise abortion so that you could have an abortion for any reason whatsoever right up until birth. There's also a lobby to get the medical professionals on side, the Royal College of Nursing and Midwives, and to remove conscience rights for medical professionals. So currently, if you're a doctor or a midwife and you don't want to participate, you don't have to. They're talking about removing that conscience protection. So we really need in the UK, and I think in America, but we really need people to speak up against this. And what happens in UK parishes particularly is we already have a focus on refugees, on migrants, the home, prisoners, mental health, all of these things. But pro-life in many, many parishes is very dependent on having either a priest who's on side or a parishioner who's pushing it. And in so many parishes, you will see, in the newsletter, actions for the homeless and actions for the soup kitchens and all these marvellous initiatives that I'm not knocking, but nothing about crisis pregnancy centres, nothing about engaging people in political action. And, some bishops are better than others. And so we don't need any more encouragement in the UK. If you're kind of saying that you're doing something for charity and you're going off to Calais, for example, in France, to help in the refugee camp, there's a whole jungle, it was called, of potential immigrants trying to cross the channel to come into England. If you were there helping them, you've got a virtue signalling pat on the head. Helping the migrants and the homeless, helping these marginalised people carries no stigma in the UK. Get a pat on the head for your virtue. Helping the unborn is like the love that dare not speak its name. Priests don't want to upset parishioners, and you're seen as judgmental. And there's many, many kind of younger Catholics who don't agree with the Church's teaching.
Right. So the context, just to shorthand this, the context that you're living in and many of us in the U.S. are living in too, with regard to the abortion issue, is not only is abortion being pushed on young people, especially young girls in crisis pregnancy scenarios, but resisting abortion and arguing against it and being an activist against it, sidewalk counseling, and also, of course, political activism, all of those things are being marginalized. So the babies themselves, of course, are being disempowered and endangered, but even those who would defend them are being disempowered, and everyone's trying to silence them, both legally, by the way, and through social methods of ostracism. So in that context, it's very hard to swallow the pill of, what you're doing isn't that important. And also all of your people chumming around with the elites in your culture and the people closest to centers of power who are in no need of having their heads pumped up any more than they already are. Those people are actually doing just as well as you. Thank you very much. It's very hard to swallow that. And to some degree, you could read that into the papal document. I won't go too far with that, but I wouldn't blame people, for instance, who are hard workers on behalf of the unborn and who are like, this doesn't feel like it's very kind toward me, this document itself. But most importantly, I want our listeners to know, if people are using this exhortation to go after you, keep in mind what Catholic Vote President Brian Burst just pointed out. Read the document, but also read it within the context of the whole teaching of the Church and in the context of our historical surroundings. And like you said, where you are in the UK and where we are in the US, in terms of social status and what happens to you if you're a pro-lifer versus what happens to you if you're an advocate for these other causes, which are very much in vogue and will certainly not raise any eyebrows among the powerful. Am I right?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I would draw attention to a couple of things as well. So when I was at Ealing, where the abortion buffer zone has been introduced, a so-called safe zone, there was a black woman who was on her knees begging, with her 9-year-old son, begging these middle-aged males not to introduce this buffer zone, because she said without it, her son wouldn't exist. And there were all the women that had been helped were immigrant women, poor women, they were really on the margins, and they'd been helped to have children, and they were being booed and shouted and heckled down by a bunch of white middle-class women. I mean, it really...
It's very stark contrast. Yeah, minorities, racial minorities and refugees, ironically, are the ones most targeted with abortion.
Yeah.
Isn't that strange?
It's outrageous. And the other thing I think to remember, is that this focus on refugees and migrants is not new. So St. John Paul II in 1988 set up the Pontifical Council for Migrants and Itinerants. The idea that Catholics need to care for migrants, for refugees, for the poor, the marginalised, the dispossessed. This is not a new thing. Of course this is gospel. But there are so many other advocates for these groups. Right. Catholics seem to be the only advocates for the unborn, and we're the only people really out there giving them a voice. And I think the Pope isn't saying these other people are more important, and traditional pro-lifers aren't saying the unborn are more important, but obviously we all have finite amount of time, and it's fine to prioritise. What has happened is that, Pope Francis famously doesn't read newspapers, and he doesn't look on...
That's good, because that means he didn't read your column, Caroline.
No, and he should have done. But, I appealed to him. I said, Holy Father, we need more people speaking out on pro-life issues, not less. And I think you can very much interpret...
I have a feeling that if you sent that, I don't think it would get past the Vatican Post Office, but that's another topic. Sorry, go ahead.
But I think you can very much interpret this paragraph as an attack, a little sideswipe on Donald Trump, because he's talking about how politicians can prioritize the unborn, but Catholics, we Christians, we can't do that. And I think there's nothing wrong in getting pro-life, because obviously a lot of Catholics voted for Trump on the pro-life ticket, and there is nothing wrong with getting politicians to perhaps broaden their focus if that's what he wants to do. But there were slightly, I think, better, wiser, more prudent, judicious ways of phrasing that, and he has given the pro-choice lobby and the Liberals a little bit of a gift, who can now say, hey, you need to stop campaigning and prioritising and making the unborn an issue because your Pope says so here. And you're just like, oh, no, thanks, Holy Father.
God help us. Yeah, I get more and more of those comments, by the way, by people who have always hated the church, and now they're saying, I'm going to tell your Pope on you. Do you know what he's been saying? You ought to listen to him. I'm like, I don't remember you saying that about Benedict. But anyway.
I know.
Well, thank you very much for your analysis, Caroline. Let's have you on the show again soon. And also, where can our viewers find your work in general?
Okay, so I write a column for the Catholic Universe, which is a UK Catholic newspaper every week. I do bits and pieces everywhere, really. I write for a site called The Conservative Woman. I've done a couple of blogs for the National Catholic Register, Mercatornet, an Australian conservative publication. Look me up on YouTube. I'm always on the television. BBC, Sky News, Good Morning Britain, Piers Morgan. I've appeared with him a number of times. If you look me up on YouTube, you can see a lot of my media appearances and work. And I've got a blog. So, just Google me. And
you've reached prominence when you just say, yeah, just Google me. That's good. But don't Google her. DuckDuckGo her, because Google is evil. All right. Thank you again, Caroline.
Thanks.
And we'll talk to you again soon. Keep us posted.
Thank you. Cheers.
Facebook has initially shut down the Chick-fil-A Appreciation Day page, has blocked a post of a Fox News reporter, has blocked over 24 Catholic pages, and most recently blocked Trump supporters Diamond and Silk's page with 1.2 million Facebook followers after determining their content and brand were, quote, unsafe to the community. Are you aware of any ad or page that has been taken down from Planned Parenthood?
Senator, I'm not, but let me just...
how about MoveOn.org?
I'm not specifically aware of those.
How about any Democratic candidate for office?
I'm not specifically aware. I mean, I'm not sure.
And what we just saw there was, of course, Senator Ted Cruz grilling Mark Zuckerberg at the hearing this week. It's pretty impressive, really rapid-fire stuff. I was really glad Senator Cruz brought the heat, because I've given him so much of my money, and he didn't even become president for my troubles. So that was nice. But the reason we're watching that is because it is time for our weekly political discussion with Catholic Vote Political Director Josh Mercer, who joins us right now. How are you, Josh?
Hey, good to be with you, Stephen.
So, can you make some sense of this hearing? Because it's pretty confusing and hard to follow what exactly is at stake here with Mark Zuckerberg.
Well, right. Well, there's a few things that are going on. I mean, The number one reason why Facebook is being grilled right now before all the senators is because there's this massive data breach, and millions upon millions of Facebook users had their private data shared improperly with all these other tech companies. And so the concern here is like, wait a minute now, if I'm using Facebook, this platform, is my private data being shared with all these corporations? So that's the reason why he's brought before the Senate this week. But here's the thing. These hearings, these congressional hearings, take on a life of their own. And once he got there, Senator Ted Cruz just decided to open up on him a little bit, and I think fairly so. He said, wait a minute now, you guys try to pretend you're an even Steven platform. You're just there to connect people. You just say, oh, your college buddies, or coworkers or friends in town. This is a great way to connect, right? Facebook, that it's just about connecting people, right? That's all it is. Well, not exactly. What you're seeing is that they're tilting the scales a little bit. We just had a situation last week where Franciscan University of Steubenville had their Facebook ad removed because it was considered violent. Well, it was a picture of our crucified Lord and Savior Jesus Christ,
They're not wrong.
I mean, it is violent.
That's pretty violent.
It was rather timid. It wasn't, and the question then becomes, does Facebook have sort of anti-Christian or anti-conservative bias to them? And Mark Zuckerberg tries to answer this. He says, well, listen, when we hire somebody at Facebook, we don't say, are you a Republican or a Democrat? It's not like we're screening people. And I think he's probably right about that. But the problem is, if you're hiring people in Silicon Valley, the whole culture there is practically 99% liberal. So everyone you're going to be hiring is going to be of the same mindset. And so what happens then, a Planned Parenthood ad comes up talking about, how abortion's great. Well, that just gets approved, passed, no problem. But then you see something that's a little bit conservative or Christian or whatever, and it raises alarm bells. Some low-level staffer might delete it or, say it's too violent or something like that.
Yeah, it's super disturbing to me, though, because a lot of the people, the low-level staffers you're talking about, you were mentioning, they might have viewpoint discrimination just on an individual-by-individual basis, and they're the people in charge of censorship. Some of this is manual work, right?
Right.
And what really bothers me is that this rising generation of leftists who get into Silicon Valley and get these kinds of jobs, to them, they don't even think of it as bias. They honestly think of many conservative views as totally beyond the pale evil.
Well, actually, that's a good point, because just this week, there's these two left-wing political pundits who said, enough compromise. Forget it. The future for America is California. Democrats in Washington and across the country should stop trying to work in any way with the other side. No compromise at all with Republicans. Just outlast them and destroy them. One-party rule. That's basically what these guys were getting at.
Yeah.
And this article, it sounds fringe, right? It sounds crazy, right? It was shared by Twitter CEO Jack Dorsey.
Right.
So this is a guy who created this platform where, there's millions upon millions of people. And in fact, even though more people are on Facebook than Twitter, Twitter has a lot more it controls a little bit more of the conversation than Facebook does. And it's very troubling to see the CEO of a major tech company basically say, why should we compromise at all with the other side, conservatives or whatever? Forget them, pass them, destroy them, basically.
Yeah, and you know what? I think that's established. Another person pointed out something rather important, which was that at the very beginning of Zuckerberg's hearing, one of the first things he mentioned was the anti-NRA March for Our Lives. And he mentioned it boldly, hey, I was instrumental in bringing the public's attention to the March for Our Lives, which is a partisan movement, right? So I think that we're way beyond wondering whether the people who run these social media giants do have a leftward bent. They do. No duh. But the question is, what now, and I'm wondering how this relates to the hearing, the question later becomes like, what can we really do about it? Is it really, it's not illegal for them to be leftists and to run a big company, right? So what exactly are we going to do about it? And can we do anything about it? And might we be, I'm almost worried, like, are conservatives, for example, hampered by an ideological devotion to the right to free speech and to free markets and so forth that actually might make us lose this arm wrestling match?
Well, that's one of the things that, free market types tend to be very, they support the wonderful free enterprise system. And I think there's a little bit of a blind spot there because they forget that, the idea behind a free market is you have two different people, the seller and the buyer, that come together and they have a mutual understanding. It's good for me, it's good for you. But a lot of times you sign up for Facebook, you don't realize that, oh, by the way, they're going to track everywhere your mobile phone is, and they're going to keep all that data. You don't really understand that. So I sort of feel like it's helpful to have better educated people to understand, okay, if you want to use this service, here's what they're already able to do. And if it goes too far, look, I'm not a 100% strict libertarian. Like maybe having some sort of basic understanding of, minimal privacy rights, that they can't just exploit you and say, oh, well, Josh, that's what the one senator said. Like, should we publicize what hotel you stayed at, Mr. Zuckerberg, this week? And he goes, yeah, no, I don't want people to know that. Well, yeah, no one wants to know that. So I think there is that privacy concern. But I do think, going back to what you said, the larger thing, what is it that Christians can do, pro-lifers can do, whatever, this kind of stuff. We have to keep raising this point. In the 1950s, 60s, and 70s, for the most part, people thought the network news, CBS, NBC, ABC, were pretty straight down the line, and they just told the news the way it was. Well, in fact, they weren't. For a long time, they were also slanting the news. And for generations, people had no idea that the news was being packaged in a way and delivered in a biased manner. So we became better educated consumers. We knew what they were doing. We could watch for what they're doing, and we could call them out when they're doing it. And that's very good. The second thing is specifically we need to make sure we call them out on is to make sure, because the internet has empowered some super fringe types on the way far left and on the way far right. And so there's a need for people to say, well, hey, no spreading hate, racism of any kind, whether it's the far left or far right. It cannot be used as an excuse to silence Christians who believe that marriage is between a man and a woman. And that's what I'm worried about. Like, if we get to these tech companies that basically say, if you're a Christian, if you believe in biblical marriage, somehow you're hate gay people or something like that. The concern that we should have as Christians is to make sure that these tech companies, whether it's Twitter, Facebook, or YouTube or whatever, don't do some sort of digital censorship against us or throw us in a corner or blacklist us as hate just because we believe in biblical marriage.
Right, exactly.
So that's something we got to be careful about.
Or any number of other things. For instance, let's say that World War III has become very popular and everyone's going to, bang the war drums, and suddenly it becomes hate speech to question whether we should go into World War III. That could very well happen. That's what mobs do. And then you end up being thrown in jail for opposing a war initiative. You see what I'm saying? Any number of things.
Maybe it's not as extreme as being thrown in jail, but you just can't get on any kind of platform.
Right. You can't influence the discussion.
Facebook page, you can't share your stuff on YouTube or anything like that.
Right.
I mean, think about it this way. If YouTube and Facebook and Twitter had been invented 20 years earlier, then maybe pro-lifers wouldn't have been able to get a stance, because in the late 80s and early 90s, if you were, pro-life, they would say, "Oh, you're against women and you're sexist or whatever." You still hear some of that stuff now, but the pro-lifers have acquired enough political muscle. We at least have a spot at the table, and they just can't shove us to the side. So
and let's keep it that way. I love what you just said about being a smart consumer. I don't know what exactly we're going to do in the end and how we're going to resolve all of this, but at the very least, we should all be very careful. Like if you see, for instance, an ad on Facebook that says The Stephen Harriott Show, you need to be really careful. You don't know what's going to be in there. No, this is the best political show online, actually. So do click on this, but nothing else. Especially not Steven Crowder. So, no, I'm just kidding. But anyway, thank you for this great discussion, Josh. You really make sense of it. I don't know how you keep tracks of these things, but thank you for doing that for us. And also, you are the editor of a very important email called The Loop that will keep us informed about this sort of thing. Am I right?
Yeah, just go to catholicvote.org/loop and sign up. It's free. We keep you up to date on all the different news that's going on through the day. And we make use of this technology, whether it be email, whether it be video, to keep our fellow Catholics informed, because that's the biggest thing that we can do. Get informed on these issues, share it with your friends, let people know what's going on. That's what I think the Lord is calling us to do, is to be informed about what's going on in the world.
Amen. Thank you very much, Josh. Talk to you next week.
Thanks, Stephen.
I'm not gonna get home. I'm in trouble.
And now I have the honor of being joined by Daniel Mattson. He is the author of Why I Don't Call Myself Gay, and he's also a speaker on the topic of chastity in general. He's a revert to Catholicism or convert to Catholicism and a lay minister. First of all, thank you for the good work you do and for joining us today, Dan.
Hey, thanks for having me on. It's great being with you.
Well, first, actually, I wanted to ask you, you travel a lot and you speak, especially to young people, about chastity, and particularly about chastity as it pertains to homosexual desires or same-sex attraction. How is that received in general by young people who are inclined toward the progressive view of sexuality?
Well, I was just at a Catholic college that is sort of Catholic only. And sometimes, even though when I go to Catholic high schools or Catholic colleges, I'm doing some evangelization. What I have to share oftentimes to young people is something they've never heard, and namely that our sexual identity is rooted in Genesis 1:26, which could be the most controversial verse in the Bible right now, 26 and 27 of Genesis, that God created them male and female, and to recognize that there's been a lot of sexual temptation and a lot of sexual proclivities throughout the history of the world, but now is really the first time that people have really questioned the goodness of male and female like they do today. In the past, there was Gnosticism that said that, in heaven we're going to be this amorphous asexual creature, and the church taught against that. But as far as the objective reality of male and female, that this is our sexual identity, today people really reject that. As we all know, Facebook has 50-some gender identities, sexual identities. And the message that young people are getting and have received, including in our Catholic schools and churches, is that who I feel myself to be in the realm of human sexuality is who I am. And my body is sort of raw material that I can shape at will, thus transgenderism. Right. And my body does not reveal truths to me that pertain to the essence of who I am. And this is really one of the core messages that I try to communicate, especially to young people. And it takes them oftentimes by surprise. They've never heard the idea that LGBTQ are not helpful sexual identities and should refer to inclinations and attractions rather than to our sexual identity.
Right. I like the way you put it. It pertains to inclinations and attractions and acts, and those are all more or less under our power or the power of our will. But when you say that you are ontologically redefinable by your will, that is totally against reality, and actually it's classically satanic as well, right? I mean, the ego can actually shape reality and undo reality and shape it to its own image. That's very dark and contrary to both reason and faith.
It's not for nothing that we hear about gay pride. Mm-hmm. If you look through Scripture, all of salvation history in the Old Testament, you see this dilemma and this push and pull between those who called upon the name of the Lord and those, like at the Tower of Babel, who desired to make a name for themselves. And making a name for ourselves, it's of course connected with honor and prestige, but basically that's the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. I'm going to be my own God. And we see that in the LGBT community really to the nth degree. I get to choose who I am, and you better protect and defend my rights to define who I am myself. Whereas the church says, hey, wait a minute, we provide true freedom, which is to embrace the goodness of your created identity, male and female, and that takes humility for sure. So part of chastity, one of the most important parts of chastity for someone with same-sex attraction is to humble him or herself before God and said, I am a creature, not the creator. And I find that very liberating.
Yeah, liberating. That's good. And I don't know if it's unique to the LGBT set of ideologies, but one thing that really strikes me about sexual progressivism in particular is that it at the same time promises to empower and simultaneously victimizes those who buy into it. And that's something you've experienced. I mean, it leads to a lot of sorrow and pain in many people's cases. And so it is a good news message to be told, you're not gay. That's not who you are. That's not what you are, right? You're a child of God. Yeah. You're a son of God. That is wonderful. And go ahead.
Yeah, it's very liberating. And we have to be careful. Of course, we have to be charitable in our pastoral language. You know, the church's message to somebody with same-sex attraction isn't, first of all, hey, you're not gay, right?
Right.
But I do think that one thing that we can do to help in our churches and in our schools is to focus on the goodness of God's anthropology, his created order for man. From homilies talking about the goodness, it's good to be a boy who's going to become a man. It's good to be a girl who's going to become a woman. We can talk about that in schools. But if you have somebody in your life who has come out as gay, the first step is to just find out more about what that experience has been, and then wait for an opportunity and ask for the Holy Spirit to say, well, when would be a good time for me to speak the truth and love into this person's life? And there are priests that I know who have been bold to men and women who are identify as gay or lesbian and say, you know, that's not your identity. Do you know that the church says you're far more than your sexual identity and your sexual attractions? So that is a liberating truth. It's hard to hear sometimes for people, but I was just at one of my talks, somebody came up to me and said, thank you for giving me permission to not view myself as a lesbian or a bisexual, but just as a woman. And she was filled with joy. And so this is why I keep talking about this. It had never occurred to her in 2018, 2017, after Obergefell, that she was something other than a lesbian or bisexual woman. That
she was something more.
That's right.
Yeah.
Especially for young people who are confused, I think the message of the church, and the church is very clear on this, in the 1986 letter on the pastoral care of the homosexual person, the church said that today the church provides a badly needed context when she refuses to consider the person as either homosexual or heterosexual, but rather as an heir and beloved child of God.
Right. Now, that's interesting, actually, that you've had a conversion to Catholicism, in part thanks to the writings of Cardinal Joseph Ratzinger, who later became Pope Benedict.
Yeah.
And he actually took time to address himself directly to homosexual people who were involved in the homosexual movement and to reason with them, and not merely with revelation. And when you read him, I think that moved you and was instrumental in your conversion. But very interestingly, you've pointed out in the past that he, in some of his writings in the 80s and 90s, was actually in agreement with mainstream homosexual activists and sexual progressives in the way that he talked about the gay identity. Am I right?
That's right. In my book, one chapter, I talk about the invention of homosexuality. The concept of the homosexual person came into play when people invented the words at the tail end of the 19th century. And there was a huge philosophical debate during the first half, primarily of the 20th century. Are we going to view homosexuals or gay people as ontologically, or that their essence is to be a gay person, or is this more of a social construct? There was a big debate, and there still is a debate among some people in the so-called LGBT community to talk about this. But I quote Gore Vidal, who was a novelist. Gore Vidal, a novelist. He had no love for the Catholic Church, but he had a lot of romantic and sexual encounters with men and occasionally with women. And he wrote very clearly, he said, it's absurd to think of people as being gay or homosexual. There are men and women, and they act and behave in ways that sometimes with the same sex, sometimes with opposite sex, sometimes with both, but it doesn't change who we are. Also, the novelist James Baldwin, he was an African-American who had relationships with men, and he said, you know, the word gay has always rubbed me the wrong way. He said, it never explained my situation, and that's part of my story as well, that being gay and embracing this identity, it does not speak into my life experience, and so I've embraced what the church says, and oddly, the church was really in alignment with Gore Vidal. We should say Gore Vidal was in alignment with truth and the church.
That's very interesting, and it's so cool. I mean, Benedict, that's very characteristic of Benedict XVI, that he was in conversation with whoever happened to be speaking shreds of truth.
It was very important for him to dialogue with people, but what I see there also is if you have different people pursuing truth from different perspectives, they're going to arrive at the same conclusion. I feel like if I was in the gay rights movement, I would still be talking about this because my rational brain would say, why are we trying to say that we're a certain type of human being, that somehow we're different than every other man that's ever lived. No, if I was a gay activist, I'd be, no, I'm a man, and I happen to like sex with men, and you have no right to prevent me from doing that and that sort of thing. At least I would be embracing reality. Stefano Gabbano, the Dolce & Gabbano fashion line, just about 3 or 4 months ago, he's been in a relationship for 34 years with another man, and he made headline news. He said, "I'm not gay. I'm just a man. I'm just a man." And I think that we're going to hear more and more people saying this identity politics is not helpful. Right. I'm a man like every other man that's ever lived. And of course, the church is at the vanguard of truth, always. So anyway.
Yeah. One thing I also want to get into is beyond the sort of philosophical discussion, you have been very open and honest and vulnerable in your story and what you went through. And it does involve a lot of suffering and very personal sorrows that you've boldly shared. And first of all, thank you for that. And I know to some degree by experience that that's very hard to do. And I think a lot of young people, especially, who struggle with their sexual identity, don't know how to move forward, partly in relation to the church. But just in general, oftentimes it involves such personal suffering that they don't know how to talk about it. And they don't want to, and they're afraid of being open with people about it. Do you have any advice on how to muster the courage?
Well, the advice that I would first give would be to parents who might be listening to this. I remember when I first began struggling with pornography. I write about that in the book. I was filled with so much shame. And my parents found, this is before the smartphones, my parents found a stash, and it was the most shameful thing I've ever went through. And I just felt such accusation by how my parents responded to it. I got more from my parents. Now, I love them dearly. We reconciled. But I just wish that my parents would have said, "Hey, I'm sorry that this has gotten its hooks in you. Let's try to find some help." The best situation for young people to find the courage is to have parents say, "Hey, pornography is out there. We're going to do our best to protect you from it. We're going to put some filters on the home computer. You're not going to have the smartphone in your room by yourself. And let me tell you, we know that this is a big challenge. And if you ever fall into it, we're here to help you and help pick you up. And there's no shame. We do not want you to ever be ashamed about telling us about something that you're going through." And, one thing that my dad told me later is, he struggled with that as a young man. I wish there's a level of discretion, right? But I think it's good for a father to say, "Son, it's a battle that most men have. Let's battle together. I want to help you." So my first response to you is to speak to the parents, and then also to speak to youth pastors and priests and say, you got to be talking about this in the pulpit and in youth group in tactful ways, but to make it so that as a priest, you're safe for young people to talk to you, or as a youth pastor, so they're safe. Young people are going to get the courage when they know they've got a safe harbor to go to.
Yeah, that's tough, and thank you very much. I know a lot of people are quietly suffering through this.
Oh, yeah.
And they need this message. So thank you for that. When I become a dad, I'll remember this.
Yeah. Right.
All right, well, that's very, very helpful. Generally, speaking of your work, tell us about Courage. What are the activities that you're doing that we can maybe support and be involved in, or point our friends toward if they are interested?
The Courage Apostolate has been going since the early 80s, and it's the only Vatican-approved ministry for men and women with same-sex attraction. We have chapters all over the country and all over the world. I can't remember how many countries we are in now, but it's a great ministry.
All of them. Let's just say
all of them. Yes, Lord willing, someday. Yeah. It's a ministry for people who want to live chaste lives in accordance with the teaching of the Catholic Church. A lot of people, when they hear about Courage, they somehow think that Courage mistakenly is some sort of group that is trying to change people's attractions or that sort of thing. It's not about that. It's about living life chastely. The goals of Courage are about building friendship, true friendship. It's oftentimes a training ground in building good friendships. The Catechism says that chastity blossoms in friendship. So one thing we work on is How do we grow in friendship? Let's be honest, the world, which focuses on Facebook friends and everything, the virtue of friendship, it's really an impoverished view of friendship that we have today. So that's one of the focuses. It's also an accountability group. People come in at Courage at different stages in their journey. Ideally, it's a weekly gathering, sometimes just men, sometimes women, and we just walk together. And there's another branch of Courage called Encourage, which is for family and friends of people who have come out. And that's a great ministry to help people learn how to walk with their son or daughter or brother or sister who are not necessarily following the church's teaching. So it's a great ministry. We have a great website with great resources, couragerc.org. There's a new website called truthandlove.com. You will find out more than you can ever absorb on these websites. But I'm proud to be a part of Courage because I think it's doing a great service for the church right now.
It's very good. Thank you very much. And again, to our viewers, we've been speaking with Daniel Mattson. He is a representative of a great organization called Courage, and he's also the author of a great book called Why I Don't Call Myself Gay. Thank you again, Dan, for just a great analysis, and I hope to have you on the show again soon. Keep up the very good work and keep us posted.
Thanks so much. God bless.
Well, that's it for this week. This has been the Stephen Harriott Show, the greatest revolution in visual technology since the invention of the Marian apparition. I'm your host, Stephen Harriott. See you next week.
Oh, yeah, baby. What you got on your mind? Oh, yeah, baby.